Hello, hello. Welcome back, my friend. Welcome to another episode of Leading Women in Tech. Today, we're talking about communicating complex ideas. Have you ever found yourself lost in a colleague's complex presentation? It's much easier to talk about when we're talking about other people, right? You're left feeling more confused than you went into the presentation. Or you've come up with a great idea and to you it makes sense. And everybody else is like, yo, what? Maybe you and your team are all on board with it. Then they go in to explain it to the audience and it falls completely flat. And sometimes you'll get looks of confusion. Other times it just falls completely flat. And actually when you dive into it, which often we don't, when you dive into it, it's because they don't actually understand what you're getting at. They've jumped to the wrong conclusion. Jumping to conclusions is a problem. But if it's a consistent problem, it's on you, not on them. We've all been there. It's so frustrating, whether it's that you're the one listening and thinking, why are they doing this? Because it seems simple, but clearly there's something missing because why are they making such a fuss about something? Or worse, you genuinely have no idea what they're talking about because they're using words, language, concepts. And you're like, what? This is not in my wheelhouse. Or to be on the other side, you're the person presenting. You're the one asking for buy-in, for feedback, and it just misses the mark. It is so frustrating to not have the words that we're using translating into ideas into other people's heads for other people to understand them. It is frustrating all around. And that's what we're going to dive into today because this is a skill so many of us lack. It is an awareness piece. So many of us don't even realize when we're hitting a brick wall, what is actually going on. More often than not, you think something simple, the other person just isn't on the same page as you. And that comes down to something being complex. Anyone who's ever had a job more complex than shelf stacking in a grocery store or delivering newspapers as a teenager has encountered moments where it's necessary to explain complex ideas. You're doing something, you're the expert in it, it's what you do as a day job, and you've got to convince somebody else who isn't as well versed in subject matter of what you're doing or why you're doing or an idea you've got. And so many of us fall flat. Or worse, we fail to notice that our words aren't hitting the mark. And that feels even worse because you just get frustrated that the other person isn't listening. It takes a strong communicator to break down complex ideas into their simplest terms. And it takes empathy and patience to recognize when somebody isn't an expert, even when they pretend they are, or they've had your job some time ago. Maybe they're your boss and you're thinking, of course you should know what I do. The reality is you're the one that's doing the work. You're the one in the day-to-day. Quite likely, they don't understand everything you do. So today, I'd like to encourage you to speak up and practice communicating complex ideas with simplicity. Something that is ill-used, underused, like not even acknowledged for how important a skill it is. And yet, if you want to become a senior leader, communicating with simplicity is key. Effectively communicating, simplifying complex ideas is this incredibly important executive skill. It shows your audience, whether that's a partner, investor, clients, teams, staff in other departments, other teams who aren't necessarily composed of experts in your field, and they don't know necessarily everything you know, but also they might not want to hear what you want to go on about. You can figure out what they need to know, no more, no less. Everybody will stop craving clarity because you're just giving it in your message. So it's crucial to simplify and effectively communicate concepts to keep up with what we're all doing. When a company moves really, really fast, which is the world we're currently living in, we are getting more and more divided into the experts that can bring their audience along with them. And by audience, I mean everybody around you and those that can't. There's a real differentiation happening. The faster we move, the more this differentiation appears. So in today's episode, I want you to close that divide. I'm going to take you through the steps of how to simplify complex ideas. I'm going to talk about the traps to avoid of sounding clever without getting your point across. I'm going to talk about the crucial skills that are essential for leaders and professionals to do all this. Whatever field you're in, we're talking women in tech leadership here, but this applies whatever field you're in. Nothing I'm saying here is rocket science, and yet so few leaders do this. If you've ever been in an audience and you thought, gosh, I just understood everything this person said, even though I knew nothing about what they do, they've got it down. Public speakers get this. How many public speakers do you know who are actually good at it? That's what we're trying to get to here, but you need to do it on a daily basis, even with your team. I think one thing that is not talked about enough is how complex ideas from the business also need to be translated into your team. I've talked a lot over the years about how your team's dynamic, your team's inner talk, your team's inner speak needs to be translated for the rest of the organization. What we forget is as we rise up and we have a more senior role, our team is still specialists. We are that intersection between the specialists in our team and the business, and we start talking more business and your team tunes out. So it works with every relationship you do. You'll even find it works with your kids and your spouse. This complexity, though, is a massive stumbling block. It poses challenges on a daily basis. Every single email you write, every single message in Slack or other DMs, every form of communication, this is where it crops up. I hear from clients on a weekly, maybe even daily basis that their team just isn't understanding them, particularly when they first come and work with me. There's a frustration about people not taking up ideas. There's a frustration around, like, why did they run with that? Or why is my boss not on board with this? Like it's such a great idea. Or wait, hold on, that was my idea. Why does somebody else get to run with it? And there is a bias thing going on. This is where the woman in tech angle comes in, right? We all know men sometimes get credit for our ideas, but there is one thing we can control. I'm not saying this is the only issue here, far, far from it. But sometimes it is also, because I see this happen with men against men, this is also because we're not communicating in the right way. That's got nothing to do with your gender. There may well be an unconscious bias, but when I've observed this, one man gets recognition for something another man said, it's because the room didn't understand. So that's the bit you do have control over. So what I want to do is to help you take back control. We're going to talk about learning how to complain less that your ideas haven't been taken forward, and instead get out of this paralyzing cycle of misunderstandings, poor feedback coming your way that makes you feel frustrated, useless, ultimately means that you might be on the way out because you're like, I'm just not having the traction here. Because that's where it really ends up here. If you can't communicate, you're not going to get the traction you're after in your career. Whether the company decides you're not getting traction or you do, either way, not a good place to be. An all too common story that illustrates this struggle is where someone is ready to present a great idea, but the presenter comes in with technical jargon. This is the simplest thing to work on. It's actually also the hardest, but it's the most obvious. You go in with that technical jargon, aim to impress clients, stakeholders, investors. However, the audience just sits there confused, not awed. The jargon overshadows the core message, leading to a frustrated audience. Jargon does not make you sound clever. Quite the contrary. If you listen to the best speakers out there, they do not use jargon. If they do, they make sure they explain it. Sometimes you'll hear them talking off the cuff and they're like, oh gosh, yes, I need to explain that. Whereas if they've actually prepared, they never use jargon. Look at most Fortune 500 CEOs. They do not use jargon. They use the language that their audience is used to. And that changes based on who their audience is. When they're in public, they will use very basic language. There's actually something like the most common 150 words, and you can try and write in those 150 words. I had a colleague of mine in a previous role who did that for all the projects we did in supercomputing. It was kind of fun. Trying to explain supercomputing and like the hard science that you're doing with the supercomputing in the most common 150 words. That is a talent, but a great one to use. But these Fortune 500 CEOs will use that very common language that brings everybody along for the worldwide audience. If they're talking to investors, they'll use business language, but they won't be using the techie language of their engineering team. If they get in front of their engineering team, they may well use more techie language, but they're not techie themselves. And so one thing they're expecting is that the leaders of that techie team are updating their language, because the CEO, even if they were a techie once upon a time, hasn't been techie for a while. Every day at nearly every company, conversations are being had between leaders and their teams or between team members where any conversation with complex ideas is being communicated and could easily get misunderstood. any one conversation where we answered the wrong question in the wrong way. And those consequences of misunderstandings are not insignificant. We have frustration, yes, but we have wasted time, wasted effort, money ultimately, repeated miscommunications. Worst case scenario, I've seen here like entire OKR cycles, like a whole quarter of wasted effort because there was this constant lack of communication between a leader and his team. And a whole quarter of effort was wasted. Really bad for business, ultimately led to that entire team being written off by the business. That's how serious this gets. And yet companies aren't spending time educating their leaders on how to communicate better. And best case scenario, you lose respect and you have antagonistic relationships. Because actually quite often when you have this, there's also not an open dialogue to be able to ask questions and to get clarity. There's a frustration backwards and forwards. So people stop asking questions. Transparency just evaporates. Frustration breeds negativity, toxic workplaces. So like it can rapidly snowball here. There are examples of C-level executives sending convoluted requests with little or no context or background information, apparently expecting a team to drop everything to work on that request. And then the response from their team isn't what the executive was looking for. And their reaction puts everybody on edge. That right there, poor communication. Or maybe as the team has worked on this, the executive realizes they no longer need the information, but they fail to let the team know. Again, poor communication. So that isn't necessarily complexity, but the complexity often is the reason why they're not doing that good communication in the first place, because they're not aware of what they even asked. The team isn't aware of what they're being asked because there's complexity involved, and both sides are making assumptions about the complexity with neither of them having the language to be able to communicate to the other party. A lot of the time, complexity comes about because you can only understand it in your language. I always think, I've heard this so many times, but I do truly believe that when you have to teach something, you have to really understand it because you have to be able to explain it to somebody who doesn't understand the lingo. And when you've got a C-level executive asking for something, the team doesn't quite understand, but they make assumptions. They can't ask questions back, whether that's because they don't have the lingo or they're not being heard. They can't get that clarity. And equally, the executive then goes, oh, that's not what I wanted, but doesn't have the ability to ask questions. That's just frustration as well as poor use of time in your team, right? Another example is when things are happening really quickly. A team doesn't take the time to understand or define what they're being asked. The team only hears the key words of what they're used to hearing. They don't slow down. They don't ask for details. They don't figure out what is the desired outcome. They just use their initial assumptions. Partly, again, that the person telling them this has not broken that down from the complex idea into simplicity, and the team hasn't asked the questions, isn't firing it back up again. Whatever the cause here, I would say it's on both sides, there's a real issue. And you can see this happens repeatedly. Even if there's a great workplace in the first place, it causes so much negative emotion that it breaks down relationships. So what your leader may be asking of you and what you're interpreting could be very, very different. What you are asking your team and what they're interpreting could be very, very different. Even when there are good intentions where information is not being withheld, but it's just that the ideas are not being presented clearly. They're not being broken down from the complex, apparently simple sentence, but that's got a lot of verbiage in there. Like there's a lot of words which mean a lot or could be interpreted in 10 different ways. If you're not allowing space to slow down, have a discussion to gain clarity, or you're not taking the time as the leader to slow down and say, like, what does the team actually need? And asking questions to make sure they've got what you need. The whole thing is complex. I was reading a book recently, I can't remember what it's called. And this whole book was like it. Every sentence was, you could be interpreting it in 10 different ways. Every sentence had a myriad of information in it. I mean, this book was a pitch to work with this person. So yeah, they're not going to go into all the detail. Like, I'm just giving you, it was a really powerful book, but like, it was just full of information. But each sentence was like, that's a whole chapter that you're not going into. And actually, to me, it would be more powerful to have done a fraction of what they did in that book and instead gone into more detail. And that's kind of what we do in the workplace because it's like go, 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 go. As I said, it's increasing as we move into a faster and faster pace of life. At the moment, there is no sign of life slowing down. And when we are expected to be the experts in our field, we often fail to recognize what's going on. We're tempted to fall into this trap of sounding clever. We think that's where we get recognition from. We think that's where people are going to give us kudos. They're not going to question us. We mistake complexity for competence. And this is encouraged by a lot of people in the workplace. A lot of the bravado of like, I'm feeling uncomfortable, so I'm just going to say big words. We all know the people we're talking about. But because that's actually, by the way, a symptom of toxicity, because we don't challenge it, what ends up happening is this is rewarded. And so we all see this as the role model because we're all uncomfortable about those complex words and nobody challenges it and they just get to go and do their thing. They're actually emulating the culture that we need to stop having. And because they're getting rewarded, there is then a culture of say big words, get away with stuff until everything falls apart. Every profession has its own terminology. Obviously, here in tech, we have ours, but tech is huge now. If you work in cloud or AI, you're going to use completely different words. Supercomputing, very, very different words. The higher up you are, you're also going to need to know more about business lingo, and that's a different field in its own right as well. The more unique your terminology is going to be, and the more you spend time with your professional circle, the more jargon is just day-to-day and necessary. So you aren't explaining every concept in minute detail. But you've got to be acutely aware when you change audience. When you change audience to a business audience, you need to talk business and not technical jargon. When you go from the business audience to your techie audience, you need to talk tech and not business. To outsiders, when you go in and explain everything in huge detail, that can also cause confusion. So it's like, oh, we're damned if we do, we're damned if we don't, right? The trap of trying to get your point across but sounding clever by tossing in technical terms is something I really, really want you to look for and call out in yourself. You are going to alienate your audience. I'm sorry, you do not sound smart. You are going to lose them. You might have them for 5 minutes, but at the end, they're going to be like, why? They just need to sound important. We don't actually like people like that. We're just sort of scared of them a little bit, especially if we're in a culture where that's normalized. Our goal is to find common ground. Our goal is to enhance understanding, not drown our audience in a sea of jargon. You want everybody to be fully on board. True mastery lies in taking a complex idea, making it accessible. Describe ideas and goals without describing them by name in technical detail or with business acronyms. You can do that. You can take a business goal and make it very, very simple, but how many businesses actually do that? To help you prepare in simplifying your message, some basic principles to keep in mind are to provide context, use storytelling, give analogies, anticipate confusion ahead of time, and proactively clear them up. And you need to over-narrate the story. You need to tell them what you're going to tell them it, then tell them what you've told them, yes. So some of this I still struggle with, like storytelling and analogies. I am just not a fan. My husband laughs at me because I really struggle with analogies. Like he'll start with a whole analogy or a metaphor and I like cut him off. I'm like, I'm just not interested. I don't know what it is about my brain, but I just get lost in like how that analogy doesn't work. I'm like, that's not what we're talking about. What is the point in them, right? So you may well find in that list, the context, the storytelling, the analogies, anticipating confusion, that you've got a weak spot. Identify that weak spot. Recognize where you're not good. This is where actually public speaking training is really, really powerful. When I started doing that so I could speak better on stage and you have an arc, it may be a better leader. I'm much more able to just quickly provide context. So everybody's on board. They understand why we're talking about this, the bigger picture piece. I'm a detail person. I like to get straight into the weeds, right? Going straight into the weeds misses that context, the people that need the context for them to understand why on earth we're talking about that. Also, the weeds without the context mean they might go off and do the wrong weeds. Okay. Storytelling and analogies give motivation. They give people who are just like not quite fully on board a reason to get on board. The big thing, the big, huge thing I do not see enough done on is anticipating confusion. I say to all of my clients, you need to slow down to speed up. We all need to slow down if we want to achieve great things. It feels like this hustle all the time. Go faster, go faster, go faster. And that's where mistakes happen. If you can slow down and take a little bit of time ahead of a meeting and say, where are the likely points where people are going to get confused? Where are the likely points where people are going to complain and not like this, resist, and proactively address those? You are going to win every time. I do this even with my team meetings. I prepare for my team meetings every single time with where's the likely confusion going to come in? And I think about all the people in the room, different personalities, and you tend to group them. The bigger the team, the more likely you are to have like groups of personalities and the things that tend to trip them up. Address those proactively. They're going to feel so much better because it means the questions are going to be genuinely around things that you might not have thought of, which is great. When the questions are around clarifying what you're saying, it's frustrating because actually you should have said that up front. Recognizing that good, clear communication requires more of you and takes time to do the prep work is a big, but it does have a huge payoff in the long run. The dividends of this work are substantial. You will find people do what you want the first time. You have better buy-in. You spend less time having to go backwards and forwards with more data, trying to justify your own existence. Faster decision-making from your team, from your boss. Everybody around you will make faster decisions because of this. And you avoid those moments where bosses, eager for details, derail the essence of your ideas, right? We've all been there. So this is really slow down, take the time because the payoff is immense. Rather than 5 meetings to get something through, you need 5 minutes, right? In order for your prep work to be effective though, you have to know your audience. Who are your stakeholders? Who is this audience? Take a moment to do an assessment. What's their familiarity with the topic at hand? Are they novices? Are they seasoned professionals? What is it that they do know and they don't know about this topic? Why would they care about this topic? So for example, if you're talking to investors, they don't actually care about the product you produce. They sound like they do. They don't. An investor cares about one thing, getting their money back. They care about what the company does, the product, whatever it is you produce, because that's how they're going to get their money back. But ultimately, they want to hear, how is this thing you're proposing to me, this change in our product, this way we're going to go to market differently, this way you're going to hire. They want to know, how is that going to get me my money faster? So their familiarity with the topic may seem like hand-wavy, but ultimately, they want to hear about how we're going to make money off the back of this. What is the plan from this spend that you're proposing? Because it's normally where we go to investors is to justify an expense or justify a lack of profit. What is it this spend is going to do? And what's my road from here to money, right? Similarly, when you're talking to your team, they are not familiar with the business. If you've just been handed down from on high a remit of, we all need to use more AI to be more productive. That's very unhelpful to a technical team who goes, AI doesn't work in our function. Instead, you need to be talking to them about, are there any tools out there that could make us more productive? Like, what could we be doing? Is there a tool that you would like to create that would make us more productive? That is the way to translate upwards and downwards. You need to be actively engaging with your audience. Ask them questions to gauge their familiarity if you're not used to them. Encourage discussion. Their responses are going to give you understanding of their own understanding, allow you to tailor communication. You have to get so good at thinking on your feet for this. It's a whole other topic in its own right. Another tool to consider is empathy mapping, which is a tool that you can use to gain deeper insights into your audience. You brainstorm what your audience would be thinking or feeling when you present something. So this is anticipation again. What questions they might have, what aspects of what you're trying to communicate could be confusing. I personally make this super simple. I just ask myself a couple of questions. Where are they right now? Where do I need them to be? What's the blocker, right? But if this is a more complex audience, actually sitting down and brainstorming it is very, very powerful, especially if you don't know the audience that well. This exercise really helps you anticipate the needs and addresses those roadblocks in comprehension that are the thing between you and what you need out of the conversation. If you are finding roadblocks, you need to tailor your communication. I can't say that enough. You're not just delivering information, you're creating an experience for your audience to get your audience on your side. There is power in simplicity. It's not just a communication strategy, it's a game changer. Making ideas simple to grasp. You're going to enhance engagement, you're going to enhance decision making. But to go from your complex thing that took you a week or a month to come up with to 5 sentences, which are an elevator pitch, is hard work. I had a client a few years ago who said, I can write a long email in 5 minutes flat. To write a 3-sentence email takes me half an hour. And she was spot on. Simplifying takes time and takes effort, but you get more out of it. How many of us have had a long email and misread it? Or worse, not really read it, we just read the last sentence. How many of us have had a boss and you're thinking, you didn't read my email, did you, mate? You totally did not read my email. Like, I asked you these things and you just completely ignored that and did this instead. If you've taken the time, I say if, like it's tricky to get this one right. Take the time to simplify as much as possible. What do you absolutely need out of this? What do they need to hear to get to that point? And engagement, and coming to the long emails, is really significant in today's information-packed world. Just last week, I had a client say to me, I was just told that I give too much information in executive meetings. I'm like, okay, great. You probably do. This was the head of engineering. And quite frankly, most of the business does not care what engineering does day to day. They care that engineering is going to deliver on the product that they're selling. But simple messages cut through the noise. Create that meaningful connection, give you reputation. Consider decision-making, right, as a starting point. When faced with a complex decision, you want to simplify it down. I say this to everybody when we're working on a big decision. I just even my own business got a big decision. I'm like, well, let's break it down. Simplicity is your guiding light. Think of everyday situations where clear, straightforward choices make life easier. A or B, not A, B, C, or D, or E. Try and figure out what are the red lines? What can you just roll out straight away and why? And that can be covered off very quickly at the beginning of a presentation. In leadership and teamwork, simplicity really does take center stage. Even when everybody in the room gets all the jargon, right? If you have a simple vision that everyone can rally behind, they can then have their own motivators for that vision. If you have a really complex vision with 10 bullet points, everyone's like, well, where do I fit in? Simple allows people to extrapolate to who they are. It's very uncomplicated, but it inspires your team to collaborate more effectively. Hopefully by now you get why simplicity is key. So I want to wrap up this episode with some practical tips for your communication, because it isn't just about stripping away details. It's about conveying the message effectively. The first tip, present information in the right order. Again, you've got to slow down to speed up here. Most topics can be broken down into small snippets, but they've got to be done in the right sequence. That is not the sequence that you identified them in. So many of us will present an idea based on how we got to where we are. We've done a month's work on it or a week's work on it. I did this, and this, and this. And how often have you been derailed at step 1? They're like, well, I wouldn't agree with that. You're like, yeah, I know, because I got to step 5 and this is what I found. What do they need to hear? What order do they need to hear it in? In general, I like to start with the conclusion and then explain why I'm there and what I've ruled out. I never start with the process I went through. By default, there are exceptions to every rule. Second tip, be relatable. Find a relatable analogy, a story. Hold your audience with something that they get. Make it easier for them to understand your message by having an analogy, telling a story around it that makes them latch on. Thirdly, use visuals every time. Picture really does tell 1,000 words. Use visuals if you can with your audience. I'm a big believer in not distracting with slides. I do not have words on my slides as a principle. There is an element of, if you are working with a non-native language audience, so whatever the language of the company is, if you've got a lot of people who that's not their first language, written down can help them follow. But otherwise, for other people, I find that words on the slide distract them, stop them listening to you. So unless you're just reading verbatim, which point you give them the slides, I would say don't have words on your slides, but pictures really do tell 1,000 words. And it helps you explain something much more succinctly, but it takes time. Have one slide with a visual, get rid of the rest. My fourth tip is to look at if your audience is new to an idea. If they are new, you need to expect that they'll understand a fraction of the information. This is where it's really good to practice speaking to different audiences all the time. You will need to have information in different formats. You'll need examples and case studies, infographics even. But it's about making sure you know what level they're at. And then finally, prioritize key takeaways. I like to have them at the beginning and the end in a few simple sentences. Aim with a final sentence that said, this is what we're going to do. This is the outcome. This is the thing. One sentence that gets to the core of the message you've been trying to get across or the question you want them to answer. One final tip, always put yourself in their shoes. Always. It's so easy to just move forward fast. Every time it's going to hold you up. All of that is a very simple way to say navigating complexity can be a challenge, but can be overcome. But I know it's hard to do this. Taking something that you understand and going, well, what do they really understand, is a skill that takes time. It's a very important, effective leadership skill. It is effective for engagement, effective for decision making, and it's so incredibly important in your career, whatever stage you're at. Remember to present information logically. Remember to use those analogies, even if you're like me, you don't really like them yourself. Leverage the visuals, which in fact, if you're one of the people that doesn't like those, still try to do it. Diversify your approach. Listen, get feedback and update for your approach for next time. I'd love to hear if this episode has resonated with you. I really appreciate any feedback we get on the topics we discuss in this program. So if you've got any feedback on thoughts on this or topics you'd like us to discuss, reach out to me on LinkedIn or in our Slack community, a link in the show notes for the Slack community. Thank you for joining me. And as always, remember, stay in your tech leadership game, follow your dreams, because the world really does need that uniqueness that you bring as a leading woman in tech.